So I considered for my Devar Torah this evening, just compiling all of the Bernie memes that we saw from the past week and playing a slideshow of all of them. But at the risk of being redundant, because you've probably seen them all, and that it might take us hours on end to get through it because the memes are so numerous, I decided not to do it this evening. Instead, surprise, surprise, I'm going to look at this week's Parsha, the Torah portion, and to see what we can glean for ourselves. The 9th and the 10th plagues are in this week's Parsha, separated by chapter 12 of the book of Exodus, I've already said, has the first Passover celebration. The end of chapter 10, though, God tells Moses to lift up his arm to bring on the 9th plague, the plague of darkness. God says this to Moses, hold out your arm toward the sky, that there may be darkness upon the land of Egypt, a darkness that can be touched. Moses held out his arm toward the sky, and thick darkness descended upon all the land of Egypt for 3 days. People could not see one another. And for 3 days, no one could move about. But all the Israelites enjoyed light in their dwellings. The darkness was so thick, it felt like you could touch it. I think some of us have had that feeling when it's so dark and it feels like it's oppressive on us. That it's not just something that visually we can't see, but somehow we feel enclosed by it. But the Israelites were not plunged into darkness, only the Egyptians. Why is that? Well, light and darkness in our culture symbolize good and evil. Light, we usually talk about, is a symbol of good, and darkness is a symbol of that which is bad. So that perhaps what we have here was not so much of a physical darkness and a physical lightness, but a spiritual lightness and darkness. That the Egyptians were enveloped in the evil that was their leader and the pharaonic regime. But the question is, from where does this evil come? If the God of the universe who we think of as a good and a caring God who's about to free us from slavery, where is this force of evil? If God is the only God of the universe, how is there a separate power out there? Let me share this story with you to help us explore that idea. The student in this following anecdote is often misidentified as a young Albert Einstein. But in any event, it's a wonderful story, whether it was him or someone else. One day, a university professor challenged his students with the following question. Did God create everything that exists? The student replied, well, of course God did. God created everything. Are you sure? The professor asked. Yes, sir, the student answered. The professor looked at him and smiled. If God created everything, then God created evil, since evil exists. And according to the principle that what we do defines who we are, then it must be true that God is evil. The student was stunned into silence by this seemingly irrefutable logic. The professor was quite pleased with himself and boasted to the students that he had proven once more that faith in God and religious belief are wrong. Then another student raised her hand and said, can I ask you a question, Professor? Of course, replied the professor. Professor, does cold exist? What kind of question is this? Of course cold exists. Have you never been cold? The other students all laughed at their friend's silly question. The young woman was unfazed. In fact, sir, she said, cold does not exist. According to the laws of physics, what we consider cold is in reality the absence of heat. Every body or object is susceptible to study when it has or transmits energy, and heat is what makes a body or matter transmit energy. Absolute zero is the total absence of heat. All matter becomes inert and incapable of reaction at that temperature. Cold does not exist. We've created the word cold to describe how we feel if we have no heat. The student continued, Professor, does darkness exist? The professor responded, of course it does. Once again, the student answered her own question and dismissed the professor's reply. You are wrong, sir, she said. Darkness does not exist either. Darkness is in reality the absence of light. Light we can study, but not darkness. In fact, we can use Isaac Newton's prism to break white light into many colors and study the various wavelengths of each color. But you cannot measure darkness. A simple ray of light can break into a world of darkness and illuminate it. How can you know how dark a certain space is? You measure the amount of light present, correct? Darkness is a word invented by human beings to describe what happens when there is no light. The professor nodded. Now the student came to the point. Sir, does evil exist? The professor responded, of course, as I've already said, we see it every day. It is in the daily example of one person's inhumanity to another. It is in the proliferation of crime and violence everywhere in the world. These manifestations are nothing else but evil. The student shook her head. You are wrong, sir. Or at least it does not exist in and of itself. Evil is simply the absence of God. Evil is simply the absence of God. It is just like darkness and cold, a word that human beings have created to describe the absence of God. God did not create evil. Evil is not like faith or love that exists just as does light and heat. Evil is a result of what happens when human beings do not have God's love present in their hearts. It's like the cold that comes when there is no heat, or the darkness that comes when there is no light. Evil is the absence of God. It is not a separate entity. So why, going back to the question I asked earlier, why is there light for the Israelites? Clearly, there has to be some light of kindness, of love. We don't know exactly what that light is. But we learn later in our tradition how important that light of our morality is. The Mishnah asks this question. The Mishnah, which was codified around the year 200 and taught us how to pray and taught us how to live by Jewish tradition, asks this question, when is it time for us to pray in the morning? And the answer that it gives is when we can distinguish between the blue and the white threads in the tzitzit of our talit. Now mine don't have blue and white threads, but some do, and all of them used to. And because people didn't have other light sources besides candles, this was the way in which one could tell in the morning. If you could not yet see that you could distinguish between these colors, then it wasn't time to pray. But then the Talmud adds another wonderful answer to this. It says, no, it's not time to pray in the morning until we can distinguish a person from a distance of 4 cubits. That if we can't see someone's face, it is still too dark. That when we bring light, it's the light of being able to recognize the humanity of another. And this is the prayer, not only that we want to say, but the prayer that we want to live in our lives. Now, if I could have found it for the service tonight, and unfortunately I couldn't find the picture, I would have brought one Bernie meme, the one that I like the best. And since I couldn't find the picture again after it came and went, I'll describe it to you. Pooh and Piglet and Bernie are sitting on a log together. And Pooh turns to his friend Piglet and says, what do we do now? And Piglet says to his friend Pooh, I don't know. And then Bernie is quoted as saying, we continue with the struggle. It's not over. We have to struggle to continue to see our friend, to see other human beings to recognize their dignity, to bring the light of God into the world. And I think it's something that whether or not you are a Bernie supporter, the people appreciate about him, or respect about him at least, is that he's no nonsense. It's not about pomp or circumstance, as he sat there in his parka and his recycled gloves. It's about continuing the struggle to do that which is right and just. And I think that's why people loved that Bernie meme, because it looked like a human being who was really concerned about doing the right thing in the world, not concerned about the pomp and circumstance around him. I shared last night my favorite Bernie Sanders story, and it's so good, I'm going to share it again with you. Being a Burlingtonian, like my husband is, and his whole family has been for 5 generations, they're very proud of Bernie Sanders because Bernie Sanders was first the mayor of Burlington. And in fact, Danny's first election he voted in, he got to vote for Bernie Sanders. And so when he got to vote for him again, he was very excited about that. And when Bernie began his career as mayor of Burlington, as you know, Burlington gets really cold and has lots of snow. That's why those parka and mittens looked just right on Bernie yesterday. And my mother-in-law, who is now a retired English teacher, taught English for many years, and also used to bring books from the library to older people in town and read to them, arrived at a woman's home, and her path had not been cleared. And so my mother-in-law trudged into the house of the books and sat with the woman and read to her that day. And as she was leaving, she called City Hall, and she said, "At Mrs. So-and-so's house, there's so much snow she'll never be able to get out. Someone needs to come here and shovel it for her." And Bernie sent his son. Just a wonderful act of real humanity, a wonderful act of bringing light into the world. It doesn't always have to be a big thing, but it has to be consistent. That evil is the absence of God. And when we bring light and love and justice and righteousness, then we can banish evil from the world. Just like Amanda Gorman finished her poem, "For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it." May we be that light.